Welcome to those who've joined. We're just going to wait for a couple of more minutes until we start. Welcome to those who've joined. I'm just going to give everyone another minute or so before we can start formally. In the meantime, I always am curious to know who's in the room. So if you want to just put down your name and your organization or where you're calling in from, I'd be grateful. In the chat. Okay, I think I'm going to start because we do have a jam-packed session today with an extraordinary presentation in the mix. So my name is Elizabeth Girdwood, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar. This is the third time you've heard from me this year, and I'm absolutely delighted to be facilitating this webinar. It's sometimes extraordinary to think back to the dark days of 2020 as we prepared for and then postponed and then prepared again and then postponed again and then saw a window between the COVID waves, prepared again and went into the field for the first Thrive by 5 data collection and launch in 2021. We've certainly come a long way. Now, earlier this month, the Department of Basic Education, in partnership with DataDrive2030, launched the Thrive by 5 Index 2024 to much acclaim. As the most comprehensive national dataset collected on early childhood development in South Africa, the index provides a critical snapshot on how 4-year-olds across the country are developing across 3 core dimensions: early learning, physical growth, and social emotional functioning. The second iteration of the index builds on the foundation laid down in 2021 with an expanded scope, methodological rigor, and for the first time, a sub-study focused on children not enrolled in any early learning program. In total, over 5,000 children enrolled in ELPs were assessed, alongside more than 270 who are currently excluded from formal learning opportunities. So we welcome you today, almost 200 of you, and we look forward to hearing your voices as we engage with the key findings of the 2024 study, which present a mixed picture of promise and concern. We use a fairly standard format across every webinar. Sonja Giese's presentation will take 35 minutes, and then we will open the floor for 20-minute discussion and a fielding of questions. You can submit your questions to the Q&A box, or you can raise your hands. The technical team will manage your muting and unmuting. So some housekeeping before we start. We're recording the session. Everyone should please keep their microphones and cameras off to avoid interruptions. We'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so please post your questions in that Q&A box. And I may actually ask you to ask your question directly when the time comes, but please be precise and respectful of our limited time here today. The presentation and recording will be shared after the webinar, so keep an eye on our socials. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the speaker, Sonja Giese. Sonja is the founding Executive Director of DataDrive2030, a South African-based social enterprise that supports the collection and use of high-quality data to drive improved child outcomes in the first 6 years of life. DataDrive2030 is also responsible for the coordination of the National Thrive by 5 Index, of which Sonja is a strategic lead. Prior to this, Sonja established and led Innovation Edge, an impact-first investor focused on solving early childhood challenges through seed capital and strategic support. Sonja has also held senior leadership positions within the University of Cape Town's Children's Institute, international NGO Absolute Return for Kids, and the National ECD Donor Consortium, Ilifa Labantwana. Over to you, Sonja.
Thank you, Liz. It's always awkward having a bio read out. Okay. Great. Hopefully everyone can see my slide. I'll get started. So thank you so much for this opportunity. The Thrive by 5 Index is a really exciting project, but the most exciting part of all of it is really how it is an enabler within the ecosystem, helping others to understand their work and where their priorities should lie. So it's a partnership. The Thrive by 5 Index is very much done in collaboration with the Department of Basic Education, and we have very generous funding from the funders that are noted here, and it's coordinated by DataDrive2030. As Liz said, the first round of the index happened in between COVID waves in 2021. This is the second round, and the intention is for the index to be repeated 3 yearly to be able to track progress amongst young children. So today's presentation, I'm going to go over our approach to data collection, give you a quick overview of our method. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'll move quite quickly, but anyone who's interested, there is a technical document which details that. I'll then speak to the findings from the sample of enrolled children. And then, as Liz said, we did a sub-study of non-enrolled children, and I'll speak to those findings. And then spend a little bit of time talking to the characteristics of early learning programs that we see, and then the practices that are emerging as really driving good child outcomes, which of course is the most important thing for us to learn here. And then at the end, I'll just focus on some high potential priority actions. There are many, many recommendations that could be drawn from the index, and we really want to focus on galvanizing action around a few key things that could really shift the needle for young children. Okay, so the index set out essentially to look at 3 key questions. The first is whether young children are on track for their age at the point of entry into school. And we specifically focused on children aged 50 to 59 months. The second is whether the characteristics of children, their household, and their programs impact outcomes, which of them are impacting outcomes and through what mechanisms. And then combining these two to really understand what are the priority actions that we need to take. So our approach to data collection, we started off by selecting 432 wards from across the country. This is 11% of all the wards in South Africa. And for those of you who are not from South Africa, we have 9 provinces. And we ensured that there were at least 35 wards within each of the provinces. And then provinces with a bigger child population were allocated more wards. Within each of those 432 wards, we sent in a team to identify every single early learning program that we could. In order to qualify, be eligible, the early learning program had to operate for at least 8 hours a week, and they had to have at least 1 child in the age range, 50 to 59 months. So we really had quite a broad spectrum of very, very tiny sites all the way up to some very large and well-established centers. Within each ward, then, we took the full list of early learning programs and we randomly sampled 3. And then when we went to those early learning programs on the day of assessment, we randomly sampled 4 children per early learning program. If they had less children, we made up for that difference within other programs in the same areas. And the data collection then happened between September and November 2024, where we collected, and I'll take you through now the full suite of data that was collected. But you can just get a sense of the scope of it and the effort that we went to ensure that the data is truly nationally representative. The final sample included 5,001 children in 1,388 early learning programs, and each of these blue dots on the map shows the location of these early learning programs. This is the index is the largest and most comprehensive survey of its kind in the country. For every one of these 5,001 children, we really wanted to get a broad sense of their life experiences. And so we did a number of assessments. The first thing we did using the early learning outcomes measure, we assessed children across these 5 developmental domains. Now, the ELOM 4 and 5, the early learning outcomes measure, is a South African tool. It's technically robust. It's been developed and standardized for use in South Africa. For anyone who'd like to get in more information, it is available on the website. And it assesses 5 areas of development that are known to be important for later school accomplishments. When the assessor had completed the assessment took about 40 minutes. The assessor was then asked to rate the child on the extent to which the child participated in the assessment, whether they persevered, whether they showed diligence, whether they showed curiosity. And we bundled this under this indicator called task orientation. And this one ended up actually being very important, and I'm going to come back to it a little later. For each child, we also measured their height for age, which, as most of you will know, helps us to identify whether children are at risk of stunting. And then we interviewed their teacher to understand the children's social and emotional functioning. And this also turned out to be very important. The scale includes 2 subscales. The one looks at the child's social relations with peers and adults, and the other looks at the child's emotional readiness for school. For the 2024 round of the index, we added something completely new from 2021, and that was interviews with the children's primary caregivers. To do this, we had to collect the phone numbers of assessed children, and we set up a call center that was interviewing caregivers across all 11 languages. And those interviews lasted about 20 minutes each, and we managed to reach over 70% of the children's caregivers. And then at each of the programs, we spent 2 hours using a tool called the Learning Program Quality Assessment, which is also a South African developed standardized tool. And the assessors were trained to observe classroom interactions and what was going on in the program to understand the quality of the program. And it looked at these 5 dimensions: materials, equipment, planning, assessment, the learning program, teaching strategies, and relationships and interactions. So we could look at the relationship between these characteristics of programs and the child outcomes. And then finally, we interviewed the principal and the practitioner at the program to understand things like their working conditions, whether the program was registered, their sources of funding, as well as some things around their attitudes towards play, their attitudes towards gender roles, etc. So for every single child, as you can see, we really try to scope out as much as possible about their life and their life experiences in order to create a full picture and understand what drives child outcomes. Okay, so let's jump into the outcomes. I'm going to start off by speaking specifically about the children enrolled in early learning programs. So everything I'm going to say now really just refers to those 5,000 children enrolled in programs. I'm then going to give you some information about the non-enrolled sample, which I haven't spoken to yet. So the early learning outcomes measure that we used for the assessments identifies where the children fall into one of 3 categories. The first category is children who are developmentally on track, and that's indicated here by the green bar. And then we have a category of children who are falling behind and those falling far behind, and that's indicated by the orange and the red bars. And as you could see, most 4-year-old children attending an early learning program in South Africa are not able to do the basic tasks of a child expected their age. Now, this tool accommodates the fact that children do develop at different levels, and that normal development is a very wide range. So children only had to score 46 or above out of 100 in order to fall into the on-track category. When we interviewed children's caregivers, one of the questions we asked them was how they thought their children were doing. And what was really concerning was only 4% of caregivers believed that their child was falling behind in their development. And in fact, 64% thought that their child was advanced, was more advanced than their peers. So this is obviously of great concern. And it's a finding that we think really warrants further attention and engagement with caregivers. Now, this idea of falling behind and falling far behind can feel quite conceptual and hard to grasp. So I just want to make it a little bit more tangible. So one of the items in the early learning outcomes measure is a task that requires a child to draw a picture of themselves. And this is a very common task that's used in tools all around the world. The child is asked to draw a picture of themselves standing up. And generally, a child of this age should be able to draw something like this. So it has a bit of a head. You can see there's a torso, there's legs and arms, and it might have details like eyes and a nose and a mouth. We don't expect that in every child, but this is kind of a more or less an on-track picture. This is an image that might be drawn by a child who's falling behind, and an image here of a child falling far behind. And these are real images from the assessments that were done. And this just gives you a sense of what we're talking about here on the scale. And these children are all going to be entering our education system within 6 to 18 months of having done these assessments. And for the child falling far behind, it's incredibly difficult for them to then be able to do things like copy shapes, letters, the kinds of things that will be expected of them when they enter the schooling system. Now, looking at each of the key domains, so as I mentioned, the early learning outcomes measure has 5 domains that it looks at: early emergent literacy and language, gross motor development, cognition and executive functioning, numeracy, and fine motor coordination and visual motor integration. And each of these domains is really important. In fact, it's more important to be looking at this level than at the total score. And what you can see is that 53% of children were on track for language and literacy. So this is the domain in which children were performing best. And children performed worse in 2 domains, which is numeracy and fine motor coordination and visual motor integration. Now, this is very consistent with what we saw in 2021. The 2021 index found this exact same pattern. And fine motor coordination and visual motor integration is essential as children enter school as the foundational skills for learning literacy. And of course, numeracy is foundation for early mathematics. So this really gives us a sense of where there needs to be a greater focus. We found when we looked at boys versus girls that boys are really struggling more. And this again was consistent with what we found in 2021. So if you have a look at this graph, on the y-axis is the percentage of children who are developmentally on track. And on the x-axis, you can see the different developmental domains. You can see the total domain score on the left, and then on the right, sorry, I'm just moving this bar. And then you can see the other domains all along the bottom. Now, the blue dot that I'm showing you here is how girls performed. So this is the percentage of girls who were developmentally on track. So let's bring in the boys. And what you see is that with the exception of gross motor development, boys are falling behind girls in every single other area of development. And this is something that we see all over the world. It's not unique to South Africa. But it is still really important for us to focus on this. What we see when we track boys and girls through the education system in South Africa, we see that this pattern persists. Boys are less likely to get to matric. They're less likely to do well in matric. They're more likely to drop out. And so this is a pattern we have to pay careful attention to. And something potentially for us to orientate practitioners around is what are the special needs approaches that are needed, gender-sensitive approaches that might be needed within early learning programs. Looking at the trends for income levels, we find that the poorest children really have the poorest prospects. And again, this is something that we found in 2021. So I'm going to show a very similar graph to what I did for boys and girls, but now comparing children from the higher end early learning programs with the lower end early learning programs. So what we did is we used the fees that were charged by early learning programs as a proxy for children's socioeconomic circumstances. So almost all early learning programs in South Africa charge fees. Unfortunately, there is no free provision. So we were able to use those fees as a proxy. And what I'm going to show you now is how children performed on either end of that fee spectrum. So about 12% of early learning programs charged less than 50 Rand a month, and about 10% charged more than 1,690 Rand a month. So just using those two ends of the spectrum, I'm going to show you how children performed. Now, these fee proxies are, it's based on the assumption that parents who are better off will pay higher fees and parents who are struggling will pay lower fees. But it also gives you a sense of the resources that are available for these programs. Programs charging higher fees are likely to have better resources. So again, on the y-axis here, you can see the percentage of children who are developmentally on track. And on the x-axis, you see again the total learning score on the early learning outcomes measure, and then each of the 5 developmental domains. And what you're seeing here is the percentage of children on track in the programs charging more than 1,690 Rand a month. If I bring in the children now attending programs charging less than 50 Rand a month, you can see the massive difference. Again, the only area where the poorer children did better is in gross motor development. For all the other areas, children in low fee early learning programs are falling behind, and this difference is significant. Fine motor coordination, early numeracy, and mathematics, the 2 domains that we saw children struggling with most. There's the biggest difference here between the income groups. And overall, a child who is in a higher-end early learning program is twice as likely to start school developmentally on track than a child in the lowest income group. Now, this difference is something that as a country we need to be measuring. This is the difference. This is the gap that needs to be closed. And I think as we track performance over time with future rounds of the index, it's really key that we look at whether we're closing this gap and also whether we're improving outcomes specifically in fine motor coordination and early numeracy and mathematics. Now, as I mentioned, we also measured children's height for age, which gives us a sense of their stunting. Now, stunting essentially measures whether children are too short for their age, which is, we use the World Health Organization benchmarks for this. And it gives us an indication of whether a child is likely to have experienced chronic malnutrition or poor access to healthcare in the earliest years. And it's not just a measure of physical growth, it's also a measure of brain development. So what we found in the index was that 7% of 4-year-olds enrolled in early learning programs were moderately or severely stunted. Now, this is quite a lot lower than other figures that have been presented in South Africa, and it's important to just spend a few minutes touching on this. So one of the reasons that this is lower is because we were only looking at 4-year-olds. Many of the other stunting figures report on children 0 to 5. And it is a fact that children can recover physically from stunting as they age. So the levels of stunting will reduce over time, even though the children may still be suffering from the long-term consequences of having been stunted in their earliest years. The second important difference is that other stunting surveys are looking at children who are enrolled and not enrolled in programs, whereas we only focused here on enrolled children. And all of those other surveys also find that children who are enrolled in early learning programs have lower levels of stunting. Now, taking these factors into account, we also looked at a category of stunting called mild stunting. And what this means is that children are within the normal range, but they're on the lower end of the normal range. So it is possible that these children would have been stunted when they were younger, but they've caught up physically. And then when we look at the relationship between children's stunting and their learning outcomes, what we see is that children who are moderately or severely stunted are already 5 months behind their peers if we control for all other factors. And children who are mildly stunted are already 2 months behind their peers, controlling for other factors. But what's really exciting is that programs really do appear to be protective. So as I mentioned, children enrolled in programs generally across multiple studies have lower levels of stunting. And we also find that when we interviewed principals, we asked about the provision of meals, and over 90% of early learning programs are providing children with at least 1 meal a day. And in the poorer programs, they tend to provide more meals. We also asked about whether the program was visited by health facilities, and we found that over 60% of programs said that they'd been visited at least once in the last 2 years by a clinic or a health facility to do things like immunization, deworming, growth monitoring. There's huge potential here for Department of Health and Department of Education to work together to use these platforms to reach vulnerable children with critical health services. Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk about what we found in the non-enrolled children. So everything I've spoken about now refers to children who are enrolled in early learning programs. In South Africa, at the time of the study, that accounts for about 65% of children. So you're looking at, or 70%, you're looking at about, amongst the population of 4-year-olds, about 350,000 4-year-old children, so children within our age bracket, who are not enrolled in early learning programs at the time of the study. Now, we couldn't do a representative sample of those 350,000 children. So we did a sub-study, and important that the findings I'm going to share now are not nationally representative or representative of this group, but they do point to profound levels of vulnerability and highlight the need for us to really understand this group of children. So in order to find these children, we went door to door. We chose 45 wards out of the 432, and we focused on wards that were serving the poorest group, so quintiles 1, 2, and 3, and we focused just on 3 provinces. So it really was a sub-study. So within those 45 wards, we sent out a team to go from household to household to identify children who were in the age range, who didn't have a disability, a known disability, and whose parents were prepared to allow them to participate in the study, and who hadn't been enrolled in an early learning program for within that year, within 2024. Ideally, we were looking for children who had never been enrolled in a program, but what we found was that children's enrollment was sporadic. So they might have been enrolled in a program the previous year for a month or 2 and then withdrawn because of affordability. So we visited about 22,000 households. This is an example of the conditions under which assessments happened. So it happened in the children's homes and often under very, very challenging circumstances. We ended up with a sample of 272 valid assessments. Now, additional assessments were invalidated because the children did so poorly that we couldn't even trust the scores. So it's likely that these results are even more are even poorer than what we're showing here. So what we found on the early learning outcomes measure was that only 18% of these children were currently on track, and 55% were falling far behind the expected milestones for their age. Very, very concerning. Again, we interviewed caregivers to understand how they thought their children were doing, and 91% of caregivers felt that their children were doing well or were doing better than their peers. So keeping on track with their peers or better than their peers. When we look at each of the domains, now this is exactly the same as what we spoke about earlier with the enrolled children. You can see there's a lot more red on this graph. Again, children are struggling most with fine motor coordination and numeracy. And more than 8 out of 10 children are unable to do the basic tasks expected in those 2 domains. Now, what's really important to understand is that these children represent about 1/3 of the cohort of children who will be entering our schooling systems. And there is profound levels of vulnerability. Most of these children, all of these children, are likely to be going into no-fee schools who are unlikely to have the kind of resources that are needed to help them to catch up. We looked at stunting rates in the non-enrolled population, and these were significantly higher. 18% of these children were moderately or severely stunted. And here we found quite a big difference between boys and girls. 23% of boys moderately or severely stunted. And 36% of these children exhibited signs of mild stunting. Now, important to remember is that these children, they're not attending an early learning program, so they're also not benefiting from the meals that these programs are providing, and they're not benefiting from the health outreach services that these programs provide. And 24% of caregivers in these homes reported that they'd gone hungry for a lack of money to buy food in the prior 3 months. We wanted to understand whether enrollment itself makes a difference. Now, we couldn't just compare the full enrolled sample to the non-enrolled sample because of the differences in the sampling strategy. So we matched children. We took the non-enrolled children and the enrolled children, and we matched 223 non-enrolled to 352 enrolled. They were the same age, they were the same sex, they were in the same wards, they had the same caregiver levels of education, etc. And then we looked at the average development gap in months, adjusting for remaining differences that might be in these samples. And what we found was that the non-enrolled children were on average 5 months behind the enrolled children overall, and more than 7 months behind in some domains. Now, very importantly, because we were matching these children to their peers who are living under the same circumstances, we were comparing them to a lot of children who were already falling behind. So what we've got here is children who are falling behind other children who are already falling behind. The exclusion of these children from the early learning programs is a profound injustice. And when we interviewed primary caregivers to understand why their children didn't attend, the vast majority of them said they simply could not afford the fees. And so this is something that has to become a policy priority in South Africa. Looking now at the characteristics of the early learning programs. So one thing that really stood out from our interviews with principals and practitioners is that the early learning programs themselves are profoundly vulnerable. It's a very under-resourced sector. We found that 85% of the programs had been founded by the current principal or the past principal, and that both this principal and the staff they employed, 90% of them earned below South African minimum wage. Only 44% of these early learning programs received a government subsidy. So the subsidy at the time of the research was valued at 18 Rand per day per child. And it's administered to early learning programs that meet certain criteria. And for many early learning programs in the poorest communities, they simply cannot meet the criteria, the thresholds to be able to access this funding. And even those who did get the subsidy, only 39% of them said that they got the subsidy on time and in the expected amount every month. So that makes them incredibly vulnerable and difficult for them to commit to things like paying teachers' salaries. Over 90% of early learning programs depend on parent fees. And when we ask questions around the training and support that's provided, NGOs were the most common source of training and support. And yet we know that NGOs themselves are vulnerable. They depend on grant funding, which is often short-term. So what this picture paints is really of an under-resourced and vulnerable sector playing an critically important role in the lives of young children. We used our tool called the Early Learning Program Quality Assessment Tool, which I mentioned earlier, to understand the quality of the programs. And what we found was that only 27% of programs fell into the good category, 43% were found to be basic, and 30% were found to be inadequate. And of course, we found a relationship between learning program quality and child outcomes. Better quality programs were driving better quality outcomes. Now, what the program quality assessment tool looks at is these 5 quality domains. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just want to draw your attention to this one domain, which is called teaching strategies. Teaching strategies, when we looked at the data, was the domain that significantly predicted child outcomes. So of all the quality domains, this was the one that predicted outcomes. And these are strategies that are used by the teacher to extend children's learning, to support appropriate levels of independence, curiosity, etc. It's like whether the teacher asks open-ended questions, for example. So we wanted to understand whether qualification of the practitioner, of the teacher, made a difference to teaching strategies. So we looked at qualifications and the relationship between qualifications and each of these quality domains. So I'm just going to show you as an example. Here you can see the learning program domain that we looked at. So as qualifications increased, and that's what you can see on the x-axis, on the left, you've got practitioners who had no qualification. On the right, you've got higher than a NQF level 5. You can see that the probability of having a good rating on this assessment tool increased as the practitioner's qualification increased. So that's a good sign, and that's something you would expect. Similarly, for materials and equipment, we find that the use of materials and equipment in the classroom increases as qualifications improve. But when we look at teaching strategies, you see a very different pattern. So here, what you see firstly is that it's generally very low. And secondly, you see that there isn't a relationship between qualifications and teaching strategies. So what this points to is 2 things. Number one, we need to look at qualifications through this lens. And number 2, we need to recognize that teachers in the classroom, even qualified teachers, are not using teaching strategies well. And we need to invest in in-service support and training to enhance teaching strategies. Here now I'm going to present some work that one of our colleagues did, Colin Trudeau, using structural equation modeling to try and bring all the factors together. So all the characteristics of the child, the program, the home environment that I described earlier, bringing it all together to try and see how we can explain ELOM outcomes. And what you can see in this rather complicated graphic is that when we combine these key variables, we're actually explaining almost 50% of variability in the outcome scores, which is very high for a study of this kind. Now, there are many factors here, like a child's home socioeconomic circumstances, that's that big circle on the left, child age, child sex. These are things that are very difficult to shift. So just wanting to focus in on the things that we can actually influence, we find that children's task orientation has a direct and significant effect on their learning outcomes. And this is the child's curiosity, their ability to focus, their diligence, etc. And you can see that there are two things in this graph that are primarily driving good task orientation. The first is the child's emotional functioning. The child's emotional functioning is a massive predictor of outcomes. You can see the lines there. The thicker the line, the stronger the relationship. And what you can see is that child emotional functioning has two lines. The one line's going up to task orientation, and the other line is going directly to ELOM outcomes. So emotional functioning has almost as much of an effect on child outcomes as children's home circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances. The second thing you can see is that early learning program materials have an impact on task orientation. So the quality and the use of materials in the classroom help children to focus, and that helps them to develop skills to focus, which they can then apply in assessments. So just to make this a little simpler, the key drivers of learning outcomes, firstly, children's task orientation, their curiosity, perseverance, ability to focus. The second, children's emotional functioning, impacting on outcomes directly and through task orientation. The next thing that matters is the quality and the variety of learning materials and how they're used in the classroom. And finally, teaching strategies. So if we want to draw some insights on what we should be focusing on, these are 4 areas to focus on. Now, what's really encouraging is in completely separate work that we've done on a study called the Positive Deviance Study, where we specifically looked for early learning programs that were beating the odds, programs working with vulnerable communities who are creating exceptional child outcomes, where children are really outperforming their peers. We went into those programs to understand what they were doing differently. And amazingly, these exact same things emerged. Practitioners within these early learning programs paid a lot of attention to children's emotional functioning. They embedded social and emotional development into their learning programs. They had activities to help children focus, to transition between tasks, to focus on tasks. They were notable in their use of materials. And in terms of teaching strategies, they had a culture of continuous learning within the organization itself. And this then trickled down into the way in which teachers engaged with young children. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes now really just pulling out from everything I've said, what are the high potential priority actions that we should be focusing on as a country? The first, the most vulnerable children are excluded. 350,000 4-year-old children are not attending an early learning program. And from our sub-study, they really seem to be incredibly vulnerable. There were much higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of hunger in these households. We have to understand and eliminate the barriers to access to these early learning programs for the most vulnerable children. At the moment, the fact that parents have to pay fees to attend an early learning program is a barrier to access. The sector is grossly under-resourced. We have to have more funding flows, and we have to have more efficient funding flows. Treasury recently allocated an extra 10 billion to early learning over the next 3 years. This is a welcome additional injection of finances into the sector. But the reality is that much of it is not flowing because of inefficiencies in the system. We must make sure that it flows. As I mentioned, of those programs that were subsidized, only 39% said that they received their subsidy on time and in the expected amounts every month. The next thing, teaching strategies. Teaching strategies are strongly linked to outcomes. And teaching strategies are not being enhanced through our existing qualifications. So we need to build practical skills for high quality responsive teaching. We need to think about what we what we're including in our qualifications curriculum for teachers, but we also need to think about how we can strengthen coaching, mentorship, peer-to-peer learning within programs. In high-performing early learning programs, we see embedded in these programs this culture of continuous learning. Learning materials support children's focus and curiosity. We need to make sure that every early learning program has a minimum package of high-quality learning materials, that these are aligned to key domains with a specific focus on fine motor coordination, early numeracy that are lagging behind, and that practitioners understand how to use these programs effectively in the classroom. Emotional functioning. I can't emphasize enough, it came through so strongly in this research, in other research we've done. We need to think about social and emotional development as a domain alongside numeracy, literacy, fine motor coordination. We need to give it as much attention. And we need to help practitioners to integrate simple everyday practices into daily routines to strengthen children's social and emotional development. Stunting is holding children back. There's a lot of activities underway to try and prevent stunting, and that must continue, but we must also leverage the support that early learning programs are providing. So strengthening their provision of nutrition, strengthening the relationship between programs and health services to ensure outreach. Parents are unaware of their children's delays. We have to raise awareness of developmental milestones among parents. Parents need simple communication. What does your 4-year-old child need to be able to do in key areas of development? And what can you do as a parent to help your child if they are struggling? We also ask questions in households around what books they had. 26% of enrolled children had not a single children's book in the home. 77% of the non-enrolled children had not a single children's book in the home. We really need to think about how we can ensure that learning happens within a child's home environment. And finally, the reality is that less than half of the children coming into grade R in South Africa are developmentally on track and ready to tackle the grade R curriculum. Now, these children, if they aren't supported into grade R, they're going to carry these delays into grade 1, and it's going to set them further behind. So we really need to strengthen grade R as a bridging year to help children to catch up as they enter the formal schooling system. I'm just looking at the clock. I think I've got 1 or 2 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly touch on how the Thrive by 5 index fits in within the overall ecosystem in South Africa. So as DataDrive2030, we work across multiple levels. The Thrive by 5 index is a macro level. We also use the same tools in the index to do program evaluations. And then we work with programs on the ground to help them to use the same tools to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their programs. And we call this our micro change at scale. So it's giving data into the hands of practitioners and principals to help them to do course correction in real time. By using a common data system, the same tools that I've described here, the same criteria and training for assessors, the same infrastructure for data, the same data quality checks, the same benchmarks, we create a rich set of insights which are contextually appropriate and actionable. These then inform action, and they inform the assumptions, the hypotheses, which we then feed into further research. So everything we're learning from Thrive by 5, from our program evaluations, from the work we do on the ground, help to inform the questions we will ask in the next round of the index and further investigation, so that at the end of the day, we're creating a richer and richer data ecosystem and enabling better and better data-driven decisions. Thank you very much. Liz, can I hand back over to you?
You can. As expected with this extraordinary presentation, the question and answer box, the question is a buzz and the webinar chat is a buzz. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask if we can address a couple of questions up front. I'm just going to not read them out, but just one of them deals with, well, quite a few of them deal with the fact that, does this include all children? Were children with disabilities included or excluded? Were children with special needs included, excluded? And I think potentially you can just deal with that one first.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So unfortunately, our early learning outcomes measure assessment tool is not able to be used with children with a range of disabilities. And as you'll know, it's extremely difficult because of the variability in disability. So we don't include children in the assessment if they have a notable disability, but we did collect data on disability. So I wasn't able to share it today, but it is in the report, and anyone who's interested can reach out and we can do a deeper dive into that. So we asked principals and practitioners, whether there were children in their programs who had disabilities, and we went through different categories of disability. And so we're able to get some sense of whether children with disabilities are included in the system. And we also ask questions around how they're responding to disability, so we can get a sense of that as well. Very excitingly, we recently partnered with organizations to develop a version of the early learning outcomes measure tool that can be used with children who are deaf and hearing impaired, and so that is now available. So we have it. We have the tool as well now available in sign language, and we have assessors who have been trained to administer it in sign language.
Thanks, Sonja. So I've got a question here from Koketso, who asks, in the current study, in which ways did the use and results from the early learning outcomes measure form data from the recent ECD census to ensure that it accurately reflects the realities and resources and developmental needs of the children in various early learning centers and programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do look at the extent to which the index sites mirror the national picture of sites. And this is something we're actually looking at in more detail at provincial level. So to what extent does the provincial sample that we included in the index actually mirror what we're seeing in the ECD census? What we're also doing now, which is exciting, is we're looking at data from the census for the programs that were included in the index. So we can compare and see how these programs changed over time. Have programs closed? Have new programs opened? Have they increased their capacity to accommodate children? Any questions that were asked in the census, we can then compare that to how the principals responded when we asked similar questions in the next round in the index. And this is a report that's still waiting to be finalized. One of the things we have found preliminarily is that about 10% of programs had closed down, and then we'd seen new programs that had started up. And I think that also gives us a sense of the flux within the system.
Thanks, Sonja. Colleagues, Mark Misselthorne has got a couple of questions, and I think it might be valuable to hear him ask these directly.
All right, am I audible?
You are.
Yeah, so this is excellent, data, and I was wondering, given the constraints and limitations with relying on practitioner training alone, and the additional 4 factors that you identified, have you gone further, and do you have any suggestions in respect of practical actions that we can do on the ground when we're supporting, grassroots ECD operators, to start to impact these in terms of sort of practical implementation actions?
Liz, should I respond?
Please do.
Thanks, Mark. I think that this is something that we need to collaborate around. So we've been really thinking about how we can make this data and these insights practical for different audiences. So what does it mean for funders, for example? So we had a funder meeting yesterday to understand how we translate this into action for funders. What does this mean for parent communication? What does it mean for government, for provinces, for NGOs? And I think the only way to really create those is to co-create them, because you need to bring together that blend of really grounded knowledge and understanding of context, of literacy levels within the areas that you're working with the data insights. And so what we're proposing is that we actually work with sector partners to co-create those kinds of resources, to translate them into things that are really actionable. And so we really welcome you and anyone else who'd like to participate in that exercise of translating the data into action to reach out to us. And yes, we'll be hosting events to support that.
Thanks, Sonja. Zena Hayes got a quick question. Which 3 provinces were selected for the sub-study of non-enrolled children? If you could quickly answer that.
Sorry, Liz, what was the beginning of that question?
Which 3 provinces were used it's just been answered. Which 3 provinces were used for the sub-study of the non-enrolled children?
Okay, great. And then I can see there's another question from Brian. I'll combine with that. KZN, Gauteng, and the Western Cape. was for the sub-study. And Brian's question is, given that we only identified so few children in the 20,000 households, does it mean the access gap is smaller than previously reported? We looked at that, Brian. So we looked at we compared the data to GHS and looked at the kind of decision gates around inclusion. And no, actually, when we looked at the numbers of children we'd identified and compared that, it turned out that the access gap seems to be what GHS is suggesting. The children who ended up being included in the sample would have excluded a lot of other children along the way, who parents refused participation, who had a disability, who failed the basic assessment, etc. So those figures do suggest that the gap is as expected.
Thanks, Sonja. Colleagues, could you unmute Gugu Zulu, who would like to ask a question about training and education?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to understand what whether the level of teaching or rather level of education of the caregivers, and I'm assuming here caregivers includes practitioners, had any bearing, on the performance of these of the children, and particularly when you compare those that a level of education and or training of the children that of practitioners or caregivers of children that are left behind or not, and the ones that are on the far behind side of things and those that are on track. Is there were you able to kind of link the level of education to the performance of these children? I think to some extent you did answer that in your presentation, but yes, that was my question.
Thank you, Gugu. Yes, so we found that qualifications didn't improve teaching strategies, but education levels of practitioners, we haven't specifically looked at that directly in relation to child outcomes at this point, but we'll go back to that. We did look at it in 2021 and we did find a relationship. Not in 2021, we combined from multiple studies when we're doing our positive deviance work. And we did find that if the practitioner had a minimum of a matric, so if they'd actually passed matric, that there were improvement in outcomes. But I haven't looked at that specifically with this data, so thanks for that reminder. In terms of the education of the primary caregiver, we did look at that as well, interestingly, and we did find a relationship. So whether the caregiver had completed school, had passed matric, had any kind of tertiary qualification after matric, we did find that there was a relationship between that and the child's scores on the early learning outcomes measure. That information, there's a lot of this which hasn't yet been published, but if people have any interest in a particular area, you're welcome to reach out to us and we can share that data with you.
Thanks, Sonja. Salim has asked a question about whether during the research, were you happy with the teacher's ability to be able to provide proper and thorough and complete assessments for each child?
Thanks for asking that question, because I realized that I didn't speak to this issue. So the assessments weren't conducted by the child's teacher. The assessments were conducted by assessors. So we recruited assessors to work with young children, and they needed to meet certain criteria, and then we trained them, and they trained for 2 weeks. They had a week training on the early learning outcomes measure, then they had 2 days of additional support on that, and then 3 days of fieldwork training. So they were completely independent assessors. Those assessments all had to be done in the children's mother tongue, so we had to match the assessor to the child. And it was completely independently done. And we monitored the quality of that very carefully. So we look at things like the GPS coordinates. Is the assessor in the same place as the child? The time of the assessment, how long it took, the language match. We look at outliers, like if children are scoring strangely high or strangely low. And there's always going to be issues with assessors. I mean, it's not possible to completely control for the bias that assessors bring in, but we did everything we could to control for that. But just to clarify, the assessments were not conducted by the teachers. They were conducted by completely independent accredited assessors who we had trained.
Thanks, Sonja. Kath Hall has a question. I wonder if, colleagues, you could unmute her for this.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Oh, great. Oh, well, I did write it into the chat. I was interested in the full list of ELPs in the 432 wards. I was wondering whether it's required doing an initial census of each of the wards, because many of those ELPs would be sort of invisible in people's homes and so on. I'm just thinking about, there's a wealth of work going on now on strengthening services in early childhood, and I'd just love to know where that, how that list was derived, where it's housed, how often it'll be updated, because clearly the formation, there's huge churn in the world of ECD.
Yes, thanks, Kath. So yes, we did a census in those wards, essentially sent a team in a couple of months before, and they looked at the ECD census data as well as any other data sets that we had. They telephoned them. They went to the sites. They went to actually check that they existed and verify their location. And they also met with local providers to understand whether there were any other sites. They did snowball sampling to find other early learning programs. We checked in with schools around whether there were any programs that fed the primary schools. So we really tried to identify as many sites as possible. And many of them are totally invisible. You're absolutely right. But we actually, part of the data collection process is they take a photograph of every site. And when you look through those, you can see that they really did find sites that were very hard to find, because there's no signage on it to show that it's an early learning program. It really just looks like a shack. So I think we've done a good job in finding programs. There will, of course, be those that we missed. And because we now are able to compare the listing in these 432 wards now with the listing that was done in 2021 through the census, we can pick up churn and we can look at some of the differences. Now, the question of that availability of that data, there's obviously POPI issues, and some of those programs that were listed refuse to participate, so we don't have any of their permission to include them. So we can include high-level information, and in fact, we're about to publish a paper that is specifically looking at that, what we learned through this listing. But sharing the actual details of the early learning programs we wouldn't be able to do because of POPI issues.
Thanks, Sonja. There's a quick question here, what the definition of caregiver was in the study.
Thank you. So we were looking for the person who primarily cares for the child in the home, and who has a good understanding of the child, who knows the child. Most of the primary caregivers who we interviewed, in both the enrolled and the non-enrolled, was the biological mother. But we also had aunts, fathers, grandparents, and others, but the vast majority was the biological mother. And we did compare our data, household data, with household data from the GHS, just to get a sense of how representative it was. And it was fairly representative of what we're seeing nationally. Just on the issue, we also, one of the questions we asked was around father involvement in children's home learning. I haven't had a chance to talk about what we learned about home learning at all. We'll have to have a separate webinar on that. But we did ask about father involvement, and there we define father very broadly as being a biological or social father, just to clarify that.
Thanks, Sonja. And there's a lovely comment by someone who's anonymous, so I can't get them to unmute, on with the thoughts on boys underperforming and how much this might be linked to gender expectations for play. So social emotional learning is especially important, and girls are encouraged to play in a way that promotes this. A hypothesis could be that an intervention encouraging boys to engage in more play stereotypical for girls could support boys. And there's all sorts of concerns about what the long-term trajectory for boys underperforming may be.
I think that's a really good point. I think that just anecdotally, we see this, people saying, oh no, that boys don't play with girls' toys, boys shouldn't cry. You see this sort of anecdotally. We did ask questions of the practitioners around their perceptions around gender so that we can get a sense of this. Those questions didn't work terribly well. We are still looking into that in more detail, but I think we needed to refine the questions to create an index for that's more sensitive. But I do think that is a real issue. I think that practitioners are likely more encouraging of girls playing in the fantasy area, doing beading, maybe sitting and drawing, and they might be more lenient for boys, letting them go out and play. So that's why boys' gross motor development was so much better. So I do think that part of this is around our gendered approach to learning and what we expect of boys and girls. But this is something that's seen globally. But I do think it's really important, and I do think that we're setting our little boys up for failure right from the beginning, and that's going to then start to play out in behavior in the classroom, high rates of dropout, grade repetition, etc., which we do see in the education system. One of the things we're excited about is partnering with the Department of Basic Education to try and track these children over time. So to find these children within the education system so that we can actually see how their performance at this age influences their performance, grade repetition, dropout rates as they move through the education system. That's quite an exciting opportunity.
Thanks, Sonja. We've got time for one more question, and I'd hate reading them out rather than getting people to answer them themselves, but we just, in the interest of time, I think it's important. Jill Nazer had a quick question about what the level of support from DBE officials was considered, whether the centres were registered and learning programs, amongst others.
So we worked with DBE in the initial stages to ensure buy-in and to get, just to unlock concerns, because obviously early learning programs, some of them were very concerned about letting strangers into their program to meet with the children, assess their children. And so we were able to then refer them back to DBE to have DBE reassure people that this was a legitimate study. Other than that, we were quite independent, and I think that's quite important. I think particularly amongst the non-enrolled sample, there was a lot of anxiety amongst parents that they were going to be caught out for not sending their children to programs. So while we needed to use our partnership with government for legitimacy, we didn't want to overemphasize it, and we didn't want people to think we were government coming in to see how they were using their social grant, for example. So it was a little bit of balancing act.
Thanks, Sonja. We unfortunately have run out of time, everyone. But there's some excellent research briefs available on the Thrive by 5 website. I know Liz Biney has put the links in the chat. You can download the Thrive by 5 reports. And I just wanted to remind you that you can look out for the next webinar in early November by Professor Amita Yaga of the Motherload Project UCT, which looks at care work more broadly. And then the details of that will follow, but you can essentially remember the 5th of November at 11 o'clock and put that date in your diary for the next DELIFA Data Drive Reset webinar. And thank you everyone for your active participation. Very full day, very full hour, but see you again soon. Keep well.
Thank you, Liz.